a small, innocent question. One that echoes in the hearts of everyone who's ever wondered about the mysteries of the universe. Imagine sitting across from one of the most powerful figures in the world. Someone whose name is synonymous with influence, wealth, and authority. But this isn't just any meeting. It's a face-to-face encounter, a moment that could change everything. And then, out of nowhere, a young girl, no more than 7 years old, asks a question. A simple, yet profound question. Mr. Trump, do you believe in God? The question hangs in the air, and for a split second, everything seems to freeze. The room falls into an eerie silence, the kind of silence that can only happen when the world's most influential person is caught off guard. How? Will he respond? Will he dismiss it, brush it aside, or give the answer that people expect? What would you do if a little girl asked you about God, especially if your every word was being watched by millions? In that moment, the stakes are higher than ever. The world watches, waiting for the truth to emerge from this unexpected conversation. But this isn't just about politics. It's not just about the man who held the highest office in the land. It's about the raw, human struggle of belief, vulnerability, and the invisible threads that tie us all together. For this little girl, this wasn't a question about politics or public opinion. It was a question from the heart, an innocent, sincere inquiry into the nature of faith, the universe, and perhaps the very essence of life itself. And her question? It was a test, not just for Donald Trump, but for all of us. What happened next would be a revelation, one that no one could have anticipated. And it would change the way we all think about the intersection of power, belief, and human connection. A moment of profound silence would soon be followed by an answer, but not just any answer. A response that would leave a young girl in tears. Why? What could have been said in that brief exchange that had such a deep impact? You may think you know where this story is headed, but brace yourself for a twist, because this story isn't just about the question of God. It's about something much bigger, something that would leave you questioning the very nature of truth, integrity, and the world we live in. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. For years, Donald Trump had built his empire on one thing: power. But what was power, really, if not the ability to bend the world to your will? He had mastered the art of controlling the narrative, of playing the game where only the strong survived. People looked up to him. They feared him. His name carried weight. His every word echoed through the media like a distant thunderclap. And yet, for all his wealth, all his influence, there was one thing that seemed to elude him: the kind of connection that truly transcended power. And then, one day, a little girl asked him a question that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew. In the grand scheme of things, a single question from a young girl might seem insignificant, but it wasn't just any question. It was an inquiry into the very essence of human existence, into the nature of faith, belief, and the world we all inhabit. It was a question that challenged the foundations of power, one that no amount of wealth, status, or influence could answer without exposing vulnerability. For Trump, this wasn't just a question. It was an unspoken challenge, a moment where his authority, his carefully crafted persona, was threatened by something far more intangible: humanity. The injustice wasn't in the question itself. It was in how the world around him had been shaped to shield him from such moments of humility. Years of manipulation, of being adored and feared by the masses, had built up walls around him, barriers that kept him from experiencing the raw vulnerability that comes with being human. The very thing that made him powerful, his dominance, his unyielding drive, also kept him from understanding the value of something as simple, as pure, as a child's question. The little girl, no more than 7, sat before him with a simplicity that was almost out of place. She didn't know his name, didn't understand his wealth, his fame, or the empire he'd built. She only knew one thing. She was curious about God. And in that moment, she asked the question that would expose the deepest flaw in the world Trump had created. Do you believe in God? Trump had built his empire by controlling the narratives, never allowing anyone to pierce the armor he had so carefully constructed. His life was a performance, a constant act of dominance, of being larger than life. But in this moment, faced with the simplicity of a child's faith, his walls began to crack. The very thing that made him feel invincible, the public persona, was suddenly rendered useless. He wasn't the towering figure of power anymore. He was just a man caught off guard, forced to confront a question he hadn't prepared for. The injustice here was not simply in the question, but in the world that had allowed someone like Trump to exist in a vacuum, a world where wealth and status shielded him from the most basic human experiences. The question wasn't just about faith, it was about the very concept of humanity. It was a challenge to a system that placed power above all else, and yet failed to recognize the one thing that could break through that power: innocence. This is a struggle we all know. In a world dominated by status, by social media likes, and powerful figures, we too often forget the simple truths that connect us all. We lose sight of what truly matters: the relationships, the vulnerabilities, the moments that ground us in our shared humanity. The injustice wasn't just in the power dynamic between Trump and the girl. It was in the system that made such figures untouchable, unreachable, and isolated from the very things that make life meaningful. In a sense, the injustice was one of disconnect. While the world around him continued to bow down to Trump, placing him on a pedestal, there was a whole world of human experiences, love, faith, fear, doubt, that he couldn't relate to. He had been so consumed by the pursuit of wealth and dominance that he had forgotten the one thing that everyone else could still reach for: the comfort of faith, the strength of belief, the power of connection. But the little girl had just shattered that illusion with a single question. And for the first time in a long while, Trump was forced to confront a reality beyond his control, beyond the influence of his empire. That question wasn't just a reflection of her own innocence. It was a mirror held up to him, exposing the emptiness that lay behind his carefully constructed persona. It's a question we all must ask ourselves at some point. Are we truly connected to the world around us? Or are we, like Trump, so wrapped up in our own power and success that we've forgotten the simple truths that make life meaningful? The little girl's question was a reminder of the disconnect we all feel sometimes, trapped in a world that values status and power more than the things that truly matter. And that's why this moment wasn't just important, it was a revelation. A challenge to the very idea of what it means to be powerful in a world that so often values dominance over connection, wealth over humanity. A challenge to Donald Trump, yes, but also to all of us who have ever prioritized success over the simple, human need to connect. For the first time in his life, Donald Trump found himself at a crossroads, a point where his usual confidence faltered and the carefully constructed walls of his persona began to crack. The world had always known him as the man who never backed down, who never showed weakness, who always had the right answer, the right move. But this question, asked by a child, was different. It wasn't a question he could sidestep with, a sharp retort or a wave of his hand. It wasn't about real estate deals, political strategy, or financial calculations. It was about something deeper, something more personal. The question wasn't just about faith. It was a challenge to his very identity, his very belief system. In that moment, Trump was confronted with the stark contrast between his life of power, control, and wealth, and the simplicity, innocence, and purity of a child's curiosity about God. For a man who had built his entire empire on his ability to control narratives, this was something he couldn't control. It was a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to feel. In the silence that followed, Trump found himself in a rare moment of introspection. He had been used to dismissing questions like this, questions that made people uncomfortable. Faith had never been part of his brand. part of the image he had worked so hard to maintain. He had always been the larger-than-life figure, the businessman who bent the world to his will, but now, faced with a simple question from an innocent child, he realized just how far removed he had become from the core human experiences that connect us all. For a brief moment, the weight of his public life, his empire, his ego, his status, seemed to vanish. In the stillness of that moment, he was just a man who had been asked a question he couldn't answer. No press conference, no scripted responses, no team of advisors whispering in his ear, just a moment of raw humanity. As the little girl looked up at him, waiting for an answer, the pressure mounted. The world around him seemed to collapse into a single question. Who was he really? A businessman? A politician? Or was there something more to him? Something that, up until that point, he had hidden from even himself. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was trapped in his own armor. For all his success, all his power, he had never allowed himself to engage with the fundamental aspects of life: faith, vulnerability, connection. He had avoided these questions for years, choosing instead to focus on building an empire, on winning, on conquering. But now, that empire felt hollow. In the face of the little girl's simple question, all of it seemed irrelevant. It was in this moment, when the weight of his own disconnection from the world around him became painfully clear, that he reached his lowest point. The powerful, untouchable figure, the man who had survived scandals, controversies, and battles with some of the world's most influential people, was now faced with something far more difficult than any business deal or political maneuver. He was confronted with the limits of his own self-constructed world, and in that realization, he faced a choice. Would he continue to hide behind his carefully curated image, the walls he had built over decades of power and influence? Or would he allow himself to be vulnerable, to step beyond the persona of the successful businessman, the former president, and become something more real? For a moment, he almost let the silence swallow him. What could he say? How could he possibly respond to such a question, knowing that it could unravel the very image he had spent his life crafting? The pressure was suffocating, the stakes impossibly high. But as the seconds ticked by, a shift began to occur. There was a weight to this moment that he couldn't ignore, a weight that demanded authenticity, that demanded truth. It was the type of moment where all the world's power, wealth, and status felt meaningless. This was not about money or fame. This was about belief. It was about finding meaning in a world that often feels devoid of it. And in that moment, Trump had to make a decision: to embrace this question or to shut it down. As the little girl waited for his response, the tension in the room thickened. The stakes had never felt higher. It was a moment that would define not just his response to her, but his own sense of self. Could he overcome the distance he had created between himself and the world he lived in? Could he break free from the prison of his own making? The answer he gave would not just reflect his personal beliefs. It would be a reflection of how he saw the world. It would either show that he had learned something from this encounter, or that he was, in fact, just another powerful man trapped in his own web of lies, unable to see beyond his own empire. The world watched, waiting. The little girl waited, and Donald Trump, for the first time in years, was forced to face himself. The man who had always controlled the narrative now stood at the precipice of a revelation. The choice was his. For a man like Donald Trump, power was a shield, one that protected him from the vulnerabilities and uncertainties that most people faced. It allowed him to control the narrative, to be the one who set the rules and dictated the terms of every situation. But in the face of that child's innocent question, the shield began to falter. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his image, his empire, and his identity began to crack. And for the first time, Trump found himself at the mercy of something he could not control. As the seconds ticked by in that silent room, the weight of the situation grew heavier. He had always been the one who held the power, the one who decided who spoke, who mattered, and who was heard. But now, here he was, trapped in a moment where his usual tactics, charm, rhetoric, confidence, were rendered useless. A simple question had laid bare the chasm between the man who had created an empire and the man who was now confronted with the uncomfortable reality of his own disconnect. What the world didn't know, what even Trump didn't fully understand, until now, was that this question had done something more than expose his vulnerability. It had also ignited something inside him, a buried truth that had been hidden beneath layers of bravado, ambition, and ego. It was a truth that he had long ignored, even as he shaped the world around him to fit his narrative. And now, in this moment, that truth could no longer be denied. Trump had built his entire life on the principle of winning. But winning, in his mind, had always meant dominance. It meant coming out on top, no matter the cost. He had won at business, won at politics, and even won the respect of millions of people who admired his brash confidence and his unyielding drive. But now, as he stood in the presence of this innocent child, it became clear that his concept of winning was incomplete. He had achieved power, wealth, and status, but he had never truly understood the deeper essence of connection and faith. The truth was that his empire, his life's work, had been built on the wrong foundation. It was in that moment of silence, that aching pause, that Trump began to understand the weight of what had been lost. He wasn't powerless, not by any means, but he had been living in a self-imposed prison, one where he had isolated himself from the very things that connected him to others: faith, belief, humility, and the simple joys of life. And now, he was being forced to reckon with it. The little girl, sitting across from him with her wide eyes and innocent wonder, was not just a passive observer. She was the catalyst, the one who had unknowingly sparked the revelation that Trump had been avoiding his whole life. Her question wasn't just a random inquiry. It was a reminder of everything that Trump had ignored in his relentless pursuit of power. It was a moment of truth that shattered the illusion of his invincibility and forced him to confront the very thing he had long avoided: his own humanity. The room had grown heavy with expectation. Everyone, from the young girl to the staff in the background, was watching. The weight of the world seemed to rest on Trump's next words. Could he continue the act? Could he uphold the persona that had served him for so many years? Or would he, for once, let down his guard and show the world a side of himself that no one had ever seen? As the seconds dragged on, Trump felt the pressure mounting. He had always been quick with words, always ready with a response. But this time, the words didn't come. Not immediately. Instead, a deep, almost unsettling silence filled the room. And in that silence, something unexpected began to shift within him. He could feel it, an unspoken realization, one that had been building for years, but that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. It wasn't just about power. It wasn't just about wealth or influence. There was something more, something far more profound that he had been missing all along. The girl's simple question had reached deep into the heart of what truly mattered, and in that moment, Trump had no choice but to confront it. His control, his absolute dominance, was slipping away, and in its place, something else was emerging. It wasn't a weakness. It wasn't a surrender. It was an awakening. And for the first time, Trump began to understand that his greatest strength wasn't in his wealth or his business savvy. It was in his ability to be real, to be honest, to confront the questions that had always haunted him, but that he had been too afraid to ask. The room held its breath as Trump, the man who had spent a lifetime building an image of invulnerability, finally spoke. But his words were not what anyone expected. They were not the practiced, calculated responses he had so often relied on. Instead, they were raw. They were genuine. And they were a glimpse into a side of him that had been hidden for years. "I believe," he said slowly, his voice betraying a rare hint of vulnerability, I believe there's more to this world than what we can see. More than money, more than power. I think we all need something bigger than ourselves. Something to believe in. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The man who had always controlled the narrative was now sharing something deeply personal. Something that transcended the realm of business and politics. The girl's question had done what nothing else could. It had broken through the fortress of self-interest that Trump had built around himself and revealed a human truth that he could no longer deny. And just like that, the room was no longer just a place for political power plays or business dealings. It had become something more. A space where vulnerability, faith, and truth could coexist. Trump had been forced to confront a reality he had long avoided, and in doing so, he had uncovered a strength he never knew he had. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about winning. It was about being human. And for the first time in years, Donald Trump was no longer just a man defined by his wealth and status. He was a man who had discovered a deeper truth, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The moment was a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone in that room, because in that instant, the real power was no longer in dominance or control. It was in the ability to confront the hardest questions, to face the truth, and to find something more meaningful than the world of wealth and fame that Trump had spent his life chasing. The moment of truth had come, and gone. Donald Trump had answered the question, not with a show of bravado or the calculated words that had served him throughout his life, but with something simpler, something more vulnerable. For the first time, the empire he had built was cracked wide open by a single, childlike inquiry. The truth that had been buried deep beneath years of carefully constructed power was revealed, not by force, but by the quiet clarity of honesty. And yet, it wasn't just the answer that mattered. It was what followed that truly shook the foundations of the story. What had seemed like a fleeting moment, a minor slip in a powerful man's world, had set into motion a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. For Trump, the most unexpected consequence of his response was the profound shift within himself. He had, for the first time, been forced to confront the real cost of his empire, the emotional and spiritual toll that his singular focus on dominance and success had exacted on him. In that vulnerable moment, he had understood something critical. His empire, his wealth, and his power had never been enough to fill the emptiness inside him, and it was that realization that became his ultimate reckoning. But the true justice of this moment was not found in Trump's personal revelation. It was in what followed. As the weeks passed, the world began to take notice of his words. Media, outlets, pundits, and even his staunchest critics began to focus not just on his political legacy, but on the vulnerability he had exposed in that one seemingly small interaction. For the first time, Trump was forced to answer not to the powers that be, politicians, businessmen, or even his followers, but to something much larger, the human desire for truth, connection, and authenticity. His once ironclad control over his public persona began to unravel. The very strength that had made him untouchable now became his greatest weakness. But this was not a quick or easy downfall. Instead, it was a slow and poetic unraveling. The empire that had once stood as a symbol of unyielding power began to erode, not through scandal, not through external attacks, but through something far more potent. The exposure of the emptiness that lay beneath its surface. What Trump had built was not a house of stone, it was a house of illusion. A house that, once its foundations were shaken, could no longer stand. The public's response was swift and unforgiving. The question from the little girl had exposed something that no amount of wealth or influence could hide, that, despite all his accomplishments, Trump was just as human as anyone else, and in that vulnerability, the world saw him differently, not as an untouchable figure, but as a man who had for years placed his faith in power rather than in the things that truly matter. And it was this very exposure that became his greatest consequence. Trump, the once invincible mogul, began to lose his grip. His empire, the one he had worked so tirelessly to build, was now under attack, not from outside forces, but from within. The walls of his carefully curated image began to crack, and in those cracks, the world saw the man he had always hidden. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the image he had crafted over decades. But it was real. The media, which had once celebrated his every move, began to turn against him. The very same audience that had cheered his rise now looked on with disdain. The narrative was no longer about his successes, but about his failures, his flaws, and the fact that he had never fully embraced the very human experiences that so many others had to navigate daily. The walls of his empire crumbled, not because of political opponents or business rivals, but because of something far more powerful: the truth. What followed was a slow but inevitable descent. The businesses that once flourished under his brand began to falter. His political influence waned as new figures emerged, people who promised something different, leaders who were not afraid to show vulnerability, to connect with the people in ways that Trump never could. The world that had once bent to his will now turned its back on him, revealing the loneliness that had always been a part of his journey. But the true poetic justice came not in his downfall, but in what Trump had discovered about himself. In that brief moment of vulnerability, in that small interaction with the little girl, he had unlocked a truth that no empire could ever replace: the value of connection, of faith, of genuine human experience. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about wealth. It was about being real, something he had neglected for far too long. And in the end, Trump's greatest vindication came not from revenge, not from a political victory or a financial windfall. It came from the simple, quiet realization that justice had already been served. He didn't need to fight for retribution. The universe had already delivered its lesson. The world had taken away the empire, the wealth, the adoration. But what it left him with was far more valuable: an understanding that true power doesn't come from wealth, status, or control. True power comes from embracing the very things that make us human. The kindness, the vulnerability, the honesty. These are the forces that move the world. Not power, but compassion. And as Trump looked back on that moment, the moment when he had answered that little girl's question, he understood something profound. He hadn't just answered her. He had answered himself. He had given himself a chance to be free from the empire of illusion he had built. There was no need for revenge, no need for dramatic payback, because in the end, Trump had learned the most valuable lesson of all: that the greatest justice lies in the truth, and in that truth, he found freedom. The audience, too, was left with something more: a powerful message that echoed far beyond the walls of any empire. That no matter how powerful we may become, no matter how high we rise, the things that matter most are the things we can never control: faith, humanity, and the courage to be real.